Is Molly Martin, People's Budget Cleveland. Welcome to committee.
Good afternoon, members of the Senate General Government Committee. My name is Molly Martin, and I'm a resident of Cleveland. And thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony. I am here today to testify against Senate Bill 158. I am one of 180 volunteers who collected signatures to put issue 38 on the ballot for Cleveland residents to vote on November 7th. I'm also the lead organizer of People's Budget Cleveland. Just so you all know, when we were out talking to thousands of people in the summer, people can't, it's hard to say participatory budgeting, it's a lot of syllables, so we're using that interchangeably. And participatory budgeting is the model of the charter amendment that hundreds of cities have used around the country. I've also gotten really smart on participatory budgeting. I've been a part of this coalition for 2 years. I work with a lot of civil and human rights organizations in Cleveland who are trying to deepen civic engagement in the city because only 1 in 3 residents vote, and we think that we need to have more on-ramps to civic participation. My first on-ramp into participation after college was being in AmeriCorps Vista with the Homelessness Commission in the city of Nashville. I grew up in Cleveland but moved back several years ago and have been doing civil rights work for people who are homeless in Cleveland, and now I organize with People's Budget Cleveland because I'm concerned about the state of civic engagement in Cleveland, and I'm concerned about the level of mistrust in government, and I think having more on-ramps to civic engagement is really important for the health of our democracy. For 2 months, I've been planning a public debate that's actually taking place tonight, and I'm really sad that, last minute, that's something that was actually more important, that civil discourse has brought me down to Columbus. Over 200 people from Cleveland are going to be going to public auditorium for a civic discussion and a civil discussion, which we find to be really important to educate Cleveland voters on what issue 38 is. Evan got lucky to come up before me because he got to answer a lot of questions, so I'll make sure to just add a few notes that hopefully will clarify some of the questions, because I work very deeply with folks on this legislation, including elected officials from other cities. Believe it or not, the majority of the participatory budgeting processes in other cities were brought forth by elected officials themselves who are looking for new ways to engage their residents. Other than the cities that Evan had mentioned, the city of Boston passed a charter amendment in 2021 that actually created an Office of Participatory Budgeting, and they did so after a decade of finding that youth participatory budgeting was really successful and was really successful in bringing young people into the democratic process. I'll also note, too, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, if some of you are familiar with CDBG funds, HUD actually endorses participatory budgeting as a process to use to get input on how that federal block grant money is spent in Cleveland. And I'll also say, too, although this has been a citizen-led initiative to get on the ballot, the mayor of the city of Cleveland, Justin Bibb, endorsed our coalition as a candidate and had supported a one-time pilot of $30 million to be used of ARPA dollars to do participatory budgeting. Because the majority of city council members didn't support it, there was legislation back in January that was also co-sponsored by 4 members of city council to bring participatory budgeting to Cleveland. And because of the excitement that we found from residents who were a part of our coalition, 1,000 of whom we registered to vote during June, getting signatures for this, we felt that it was important to follow the advice of what other elected officials and cities have found, which is going after year, how are we going to do PB? It's hard to really establish the civic infrastructure for our process. So actually institutionalizing it in the charter and doing so in a way that's flexible so that the administration and city council can kind of troubleshoot how the process works as a best practice for the cities that are doing PB. And I just want to say in terms of the accountability of the process, all projects selected by residents have to be projects that benefit the public because they have to comply with state laws around procurement and bargaining. They have to pass through the city's Board of Control. Of all the members of the steering committee, half are appointed by city council, half are appointed by the mayor, and their job is to shepherd a process. And there are hundreds of cities around the country that have figured out how this process can work and how it can be done so with trust. I do have a couple of questions for the committee, maybe that they can be answered or just food for thought. But I'm really concerned that, our goal is to build more trust and to get people engaged and to get people vote in Cleveland. And I feel like the timing of this bill is really terrible. It's going to increase mistrust among Cleveland voters who want to have the opportunity to vote on it on November 7th. And I think if the philosophy of creating a limitation on government powers and for local municipalities to self-govern resonates with you all, then please vote against this bill and let Cleveland voters decide on issue 8 for themselves. I fear that state interference in local issues is only going to further alienate people from the democratic process, and that democracy is best served when we trust the discretion of voters and of local governments to implement policies that address their unique needs and their unique problems. I'm really concerned about the timing of this bill, and I really hope that you all honor Cleveland's home rule right to self-govern. And I just want to say, too, if you look, and I'm very happy to provide information about participatory budgeting from other cities, but the vast majority of projects that residents select are projects that are implemented by city departments, implemented by city unions on capital projects for, playground improvements, and the majority of the projects are implemented by public unions in particular. I'd like to just pause to see if there are any questions from the committee. Thank you for your consideration and opportunity to provide testimony.
Sure.
Senator Serino.
Great, thank you, Chair. Thanks for your testimony today, for coming down. Hope you can get back in time for the other meeting. So look, I certainly applaud your interest in more civic engagement in Cleveland. Again, I've been around the Cleveland area for a lifetime, and there's never anything wrong with more activity and more participation, for sure. By the way, I share your concern about saying the words participatory budgeting. I wish there was, what do you use in place of it?
We say PB or people's budget.
Okay, okay. I can't do the people's budget. It sounds like North Korea to me, but so just one question. When you talk about in section 204-5B of the charter amendment, it indicates spending through the People's Budget Fund must comply with all applicable state and federal laws. So if we look at in the Ohio Revised Code, section 705.19, and I'll just read one sentence of it. No money shall be drawn from the treasury of a municipal corporation except in pursuance of appropriations made by the legislative authority. And it goes on from there, but that's the relevant topic here. So one could argue that this would be in violation, spending of those monies, the 2%, would be in violation of that. And that's the same section of Revised Code where this bill, if and when signed into law, would come into. So have you guys looked at that? And do you have a position on the interpretation?
Yeah, so I think through the chair to Senator Serino, I think part of the reason there aren't actual revenue sources named in the charter amendment is because it would be up to the administration to look at the pot of CDBG funding that normally City Council is approving, to look at the different categories of capital funding such as road repairs and bridges, to say which pots of funding actually make sense for the public to weigh in on. When a 16-year-old wants a new basketball court in their neighborhood and they might put that project up for a proposal for the committee to consider and maybe put on a ballot, we have to make sure when we're communicating to the public in the process that we know that eventually the pots of funds that would fund the projects in particular are ones that the ideas match so that they can comply with federal and state law. And so I think that, the process itself of determining where, say, the $14 million would come from would include a lot of work from the city's chief financial officer in collaboration with City Council to say this, bucket of CDBG funding, this part of the capital budget, these pots of discretionary funding, to know that during the process, and just so you all know, participatory budgeting processes typically take about 10 months. And there's 3 months of ramp up of planning the process and hosting idea sessions at libraries, at schools, and other places where you want to engage people who typically don't participate. And then there's a 4-month process where the members of the steering committee are really getting a crash course in working with the experts of city departments who eventually put these proposals together. So you're working in collaboration with city departments who know that these projects would be ones that would normally be executed by Public Works and Community Development. And then in order for that proposal to go on a ballot, we have to make sure that it follows state law and actually meets the needs and the requirements from the designated funds that were set out for the process. And then, say for example, there were 6 different election processes across different neighborhoods. There are 20 projects at the end. Then the city is required to do an open RFP process so that so that it's open and that folks who say, oh, this is a project for a mental health crisis pilot, maybe EMS would implement that. Or if, there's just the legal requirements of procurement for them to respond to that. A lot of that process is planned with the city so that it's not like Molly's Lemonade Stand is the project she wants people to vote on. Oftentimes, part of the process for residents is you bring your complaints to city council, but oftentimes the thing that you want done actually can't be spent on public money. So part of this is an empathy building and an understanding of budgeting and government about how can we actually use our taxpayer dollars. And if we're to build a civic engagement pipeline in the city, a lot of it is really learning about those trade-offs and really just in the spirit of deliberative democracy, seeing how 1,000 ideas go to 20 and how those 20 projects that get implemented in the city reflected the will of the people, but also complied with what it meant to run a city government that's following the law.
Follow-up?
Thank you, Chair. So again, the charter amendment language that would take letting out of contracts out of the purview of City Council in the Mayor's office, again, to me flies in the face of Section 705 that I indicated before. I just want to mention one other question on community development block grant funding. I was a county commissioner previously in Lake County. And every year we had, I don't know, $1.5 million that we got from HUD. Mm-hmm. And we would hold hearings at the commissioner's office. This was a county government, so it's a little different. But we would hold hearings, and individuals would come in from all kinds of groups and asking for some part of that money. And we would hear them, and they would make their case, and we would ultimately make our final decision. I think that was participatory budgeting in a sense in terms of listening to inputs from the community. For community development block grants in the city of Cleveland, are there no input opportunities at all under the current scenario?
Yeah, the city offers a pretty robust process where residents can come to City Hall to provide comment. I'll say the city of Sacramento, in their participatory budgeting process, they do it for CDBG funds. And I think the difference between participatory budgeting and making comment is like me saying I'm going to come and make public comment to say I'm going to vote for Senator Serino, but having the opportunity to vote for him on a ballot is different. And so I think when people actually learn democracy by doing and can see the experience of among thousands of Clevelanders, are ranking these neighborhood projects is a little bit different of an experience than submitting a public comment and hoping that maybe that idea will be reflected in the use of the funds.
Okay, thank you.
And Senator DeMora.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I want to comment on something you said in your testimony toward the end and about the working with the city unions on all this stuff. I mean, I've had 4 phone calls for me to vote yes on this, and they all came from the city unions that represent all the city workers. I mean, firefighters, the police, building trades, and AFSCME. So if they're opposed to this, I don't understand why they're worried because you're taking $14 million out of it, and they're 70% of the city's budget, so obviously a disproportionate amount of the money is going to come out of the budget that goes towards safety forces and the workers for the city. So how is that justifiable?
Yeah, I mean, when we launched this campaign back in May, we had reached out to every public union with a CBA with the city and to other unions in Cleveland and offered to meet with them to talk about the details of participatory budgeting. And unfortunately, because of the tight timeline, I think that city council members who oppose it got to those folks first. And I think there's low information on the reality of what projects get funded. And unfortunately, for too long, I think a lot of public sector unions have had to go to the negotiation table with a scarcity mindset out of fear that if there's something that's passed that will require a piece of the budget, then will that mean that they won't get funded? But lots of places in other cities find that the projects residents vote on reflect how city council members would select that money. And that's the backdrop of this too, is that there really shouldn't be a difference between our elected representatives spending money on what reflects the will of the people. And that's why so many elected officials brought forth participatory budgeting. And I think that a lack of information and a scarcity mindset about not understanding that PB projects are going to be implemented by the same departments that represent public sector employees.
Okay. One quick follow-up. So,
Follow-up?
So I asked this question of the other gentleman. I mean, I'm concerned about this $500,000 that becomes more every year by 2% on, I mean, you talk about using this money for all kind of things, but he also said was set up an election. I can tell you that knowing the cost of an election in the city of Cleveland, I mean, it's not a substantial amount of cost to try to set up an election if you're going to have a participatory amongst all across the city. And I don't know if you're paying people $5,000 each and you have to hire consultants and you're doing this and doing that, and you're left with $150,000 to actually inform people and conduct this election. How are you going to do that? Because you cannot conduct a citywide election for $150,000. I mean, it's impossible. I mean, elections cost, millions of dollars in large counties and large cities like Columbus and Cleveland. It costs a lot to get locations, to hire poll workers, are you going to use the machines that the county uses, or are you going to use your own machines? I mean, has anybody given that amount of thought? I mean, elections, those of us who do elections for a living, they're not as simple as people make them out to be.
Yeah, and I appreciate that through the chair to Senator DeMora. We did not just pick $500,000 out of the blue. We had consulted the Participatory Budgeting Project, who has worked with hundreds of municipalities to implement it. And there is a breakdown of a budget on what those specific costs would be. A lot of running a process like this is relying on the existing nonprofit and community development infrastructure that already has pathways and community groups of people. There are government high school classes, there are block clubs, all of the civic infrastructure that we think of, we would be tapping into that. And I'll say too, the 2% increase, because it's listed as like a flat amount, that is mostly to account for inflation over time and not just a gross increase of the administration process. And a lot of that reflects too, when you look at over the revenue growth of Cleveland over the last decade, if the city's budget's growing, then the administration for that might have to account for that. And even though the last 100 years we haven't seen this, our hope is that more people move into the city of Cleveland, and I think that's in line with what economic development interests in the city would like to see as well. And the breakdown of that administrative budget shows what are I look at the administration as a civic education program, right? For someone to serve on the steering committee, it's a 2-year commitment. You're doing a lot of homework, and you're really doing a lot of engagement work in the community, and that time is just a modest stipend for them to serve in that role in that way. And other cities that do participatory budgeting, they find that their board of elections are like, hey, you're doing this this voting process during August, let us lend our vote boxes. And it's really relying on the infrastructure of the very large nonprofit sector in Cleveland and community development infrastructure to help be a part of that process and to add their resources. And to me, any organization that's getting philanthropic funding on civic education and voter engagement, this is a great opportunity to say, how are you going to, get people onto this pipeline to be a part of the civic education in this participatory process for them. So that administration alone is really just helping establish the framework for it that we hope other organizations doing that work in the community can add to it so that it can, to your point, offer the capacity to run a community-based election on taxpayer dollars so that it could be successful.
I have a question. So as elected officials, we fill out finance statements, and this is all public and transparent, and we're bound by ethical considerations. We need to make sure we don't have any conflicts of interest in things we're doing. What prevents someone who has an interest in something pushing to support that project to serve their own interests? And is that transparent to the public that they would have that conflict?
Yeah, definitely. I think the open application where residents who would like to serve on the steering committee would include a history of what their relationship is to the community. And I think when city council and the mayor's administration come together to make those appointments, part of that job is to say, how are we avoiding conflicts of interest? What some other cities have done too is they don't allow organizations to submit ideas. It can one idea can only come from one resident. And ultimately those ideas go through a process that are vetted into proposals, and that doesn't include any organization that might have that. And then once the voting process takes place, the winning projects then have to go through the procurement process, and that process in itself for those contracts to be prepared and then approved have to go through the legal process for procurement to help in that process avoid a conflict of interest.
So are these public finance statements that would disclose investments and open to public scrutiny?
Yeah, well, given that all the steering committee meetings would be subject to sunshine law, that would be public record. And just based on the evidence of, I think it's somewhere around $200 to $300 million of public money in the U.S. have been decided through participatory budgeting. If you do a breakdown of that money, you'll see that the majority of projects are actually implemented by public departments. So it's actually not a huge portion of projects that would be contracted out to an organization. But it's really not a cut to the budget, but a prioritization of how certain city departments would fulfill those requests to do that. So I think as far as how that's reflected in the budget of the department who's the implementer of the project, that's how that process works.
Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.